Oh, this is Gus. Okay, sorry about that. We had an audio challenge. So we are back. I want to thank Dan and Jim for being here today. I also want to thank everybody who stayed on for 2 minutes when we lost our audio. I also want to thank the number of people that attended. We never expected to use this many seats on our GoToWebinar subscription. So thank you all for taking time today to go through this topic that has a lot of interest lately. So today we're going to talk about something that's in our mission statement, delivering the future into the present, and how projects actually do deliver the future. Once we go through that, I'll pass it off to my colleague to talk about project definition, and once those projects are defined, the challenges around execution. Project and portfolio management best practices. So we'll walk through some of the things that are critical to making an EPMO successful. And once we go through that process, we're going to talk about some solutions, a methodology to implement change, and we'll leave some time for question and answer at the end. So when we talk about projects deliver the future, there's this idea that how do we think about how a mission of an organization gets delivered. So for example, if we think about, why does an organization exist from their mission all the way down through, the values or the ethics of an organization, the vision of like 3 to 5 years, 1 to 3 years, 7 to 10 years, whatever that planning horizon is, and eventually we get to the idea of strategy or change. So, but the challenge is, it's actually getting it done, right? That's what that first quote was. Is that how do we actually deliver the change and get the projects to be successful? So what we want to talk about is this idea of how really does deliver the future. So these projects are really executing a mission that supports the overall vision that's out there on the horizon, and ultimately what this boils down to is how do we get first the right ships in the armada, and secondly how do we ensure that each the horizon. Well, if I'm the project manager, I'm the captain of the ship, or I hear this term occasionally, temporarily, the entrepreneurial project manager. This is something that we are playing as project managers to deliver the future. And when the project doesn't meet that, doesn't get to that lighthouse, when the mission fails for that project, that potential value is lost, right? And so today we want to talk about this concept of what do we mean by an enterprise project management office? How do they come about to really drive this connection that we're going to talk about between execution at the portfolio level and projects at the execution level. So this idea of the disconnect between the overall mission and vision and the supporting goals and strategy, and ultimately it's all about getting it done. It's about this, anybody, as they said in Seinfeld, anybody can take the reservation, right? But it's actually holding the reservation and delivering that it's all about, right? And that's what this is all about. It's about really delivering. And when we get a call about bringing a PMO together, pretty much, I don't know if you would agree with this, but pretty close to 100% of customers saying that's pretty important. And so I think it's this idea that when things are floundering and they're at the highest level of the organization, what we see is an allocation of capital, for example, and an inability to actually spend the money. We don't have enough good project managers to make this happen. And, you know, when you start looking at, a large portfolio, an enterprise portfolio that's at the highest level of the organization where it really is delivering that vision, that's a pretty serious proposition to deal with. So let's take a double click on that. And, you know, the first question is, well, what are the right projects? You know, we talk about this as right projects done right. And one of the first things we encounter is a lot of informality about how we really decide what the right project is. A lot of the answer, and Jim will go in deeper into this when we get to the best practices, but if we think about what a right project looks like, we start thinking about how do we align to that vision of the organization? How do we ensure that we're selecting the highest ROI, which is really a business case? And when we think about that, where does that information come from? How valid is it? What is marketing doing to say we've got the pulse on the marketplace, we know what the demand is out there, we know what the innovations need to be to deliver that vision that supports our mission? And so, you know, even if we have this information, the question is it really being documented? You know, is it being put into a business case? Or do we have a slate of business cases? Do we have a way to compare these things to pick the best ones? And so, again, when we get into deeper into the best practices, we want to talk about that. But, you know, so the first point of context is how do we really ensure at an enterprise level that we're working on the right stuff? And, you know, and executives are afraid of this stuff sometimes because the one thing we didn't put on here, but it's a factor, is my pet project's not going to make it. I've heard this, somebody say one time, we're going to homogenize the selection process. We're going to have, a piece of software tell me how my company's going to run. And, you know, so when I hear that, I add a sixth bullet here called expert judgment, right? I mean, yes, we have seasoned, smart people that know the business. So, yeah, does it count if their score becomes part of the weighting to get an efficient set of initiatives? Yeah, sure. You know, do we see things in there that have to be the right project? Because Congress said so, those things aren't fun either. So all of these have to be considered. But now let's talk about execution a little bit. Let's talk about the challenges. So the question we have is, what are the biggest your mission on the console? So take a minute and start weighing in, project clarity, project alignment with the performance. But it took a little bit of time to read. The numbers are rolling in. Wow. What do we call this? What do we call, Jim? It's real nip and tuck. Yeah, it's looking pretty close. Not sure I don't know what to expect. Wow, it's close. There with splitting the vote there across multiple people. Yeah. We'd have to have 3 answers instead of 5, though. At this point. Okay. So how do we show the poll? There it is. So here's what we have. You should be seeing on your screens the biggest barriers that prevents projects from delivering your mission. We have the winner by 8% is lack of alignment, project alignment with corporate mission. So that's kind of scary. It's off the page for you. Any surprises here? The lowest, pretty balanced, huh? Inability to deal with cross-project dependencies and lack of clarity over corporate mission.
I like the fact that lack of project alignment is at the top. I like that one because I think that's an easier correction than the execution piece. So
we're not knowing what our mission is.
So that's part of the challenge, I think, when we get into helping organizations understand their portfolios. We often have to take a step back because what we find is their strategy is not fully defined or defined at the right level of detail. So we don't have enough information to actually create, kind of a project scorecard that can assess the business value of the individual projects that are coming through the pipeline.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for bearing your souls for the. At this point, I'm going to over to my colleague, Mr. Colton, he's our practice director for practice. Thanks, Jim.
Yes. So we're going to start presentations in EPMO space, starting with a lack of clarity of the corporate vision, mission, and/or strategy. There it goes. So, as I mentioned earlier, when we start the portfolio management process, we ask for, show me your business strategy, show me what are the key corporate objectives and goals. And often, more often than not, those goals and objectives are not fully fleshed out, or there's not even agreement in terms of what the overall objectives are. They're not either precise, or they're spread out across divisions, or they're just vague. And in order to come up with a way to prioritize projects, you need very specific business drivers or goals, if you want to call them that. So often we have to take a step back and revisit the strategy to flesh it out and gain more clarity. And then we can proceed with the portfolio management development of that process. Difficulty in selecting the right projects. Again, this can be a challenge because many organizations are still, rather old school, where one or two individuals are dominating the initiatives that move forward. And often, in those cases, the highest value projects are not always being selected. So we propose to our clients to come up with more quantitative approach to that project. Usually, by the business goals or drivers. I'm going to talk a little bit more deeply about that topic when we get to best practices. Next up, and this is a problem we see across all clients: the inability to quantify the company's overall resource capacity and availability. And it usually, the root cause of this is usually the lack of strong planning, both for active projects and those projects being closed. Often we see a lack of detailed definitions around the project's objectives. The inability to create a strong business case and clarify the project's success criteria. Answering the question, what do you really expect at the end of the day? What do you want this project to produce? And often that's, again, left somewhat vague. Another challenge that we see is the inability to identify cross-project dependencies. Often organizations have projects that are dependent on one another, but they're in different divisions or departments, and they're not always communicating or collaborating. They're kind of running in silos. So we often see stumbling blocks in terms of misses of project milestones due to lack of clarity in these dependencies. And last but not least, some of the key challenges of, kind of the inability to improve on project management or portfolio management. So the lack of a skill set with regard to overall improvement of process. And Gus likes to talk about Mr. Magoo, where he finds his glasses because he's blind, and his glasses are always somewhere else. So it's really about how to create the structure and bring in the right skill set to move the organizations forward. So I'm going to start best practices with another poll. I'm going to launch it here. What area of project strategy and or execution does your organization do the best? Selecting the right projects. This is what you do well. Like, are you strong at delivering on spec, delivering on schedule, keeping the business case relevant, or would you choose, none of the above? So I'll give you, hopefully that last choice doesn't come to the top of the heap here. Give you folks a minute. Oh, again, it's a tight contest, Gus. There's no clear front runner.
I expect number 5 to get so many answers. What did we leave off?
It's a bit surprising. We could interpret that in a couple different ways.
Oh, it was meant to say we don't do anything. We don't do any of those things well. So that's what if you chose none of the above, that's how we're interpreting that.
All right, let's.
I guess I'm not surprised. Let's see what we get.
At the top of the heap, we do have none in the above. So not completely surprising. Selecting right projects came in at number 3. Right behind delivering the projects on spec was at number 2. So we see that more organizations are able to deliver, at least on spec, than actually selecting the right projects. Delivering on schedule kind of trailed, and then finally keeping the business case relevant. That's no surprise. Most organizations are fairly immature in the process around business case validation, and we'll talk in a little bit more detail on that topic in a few minutes. So thanks for your participation in that poll. I'm going to jump into best practices now. And I will say that each of these topics can be a webinar in and of themselves, so I'm not going to cover them in a lot of detail, but I'm really focused on the big picture and how these best practices tie together. So we're going to start with, we're going to talk about portfolio management as a best practice. We're going to talk about project management. Life cycle management, meaning, how do you actually produce the widget that you're looking to produce? What's the process that you go through to produce that product or service? We're going to talk about maybe a concept that you haven't heard much about before, but integration of portfolio, project, and life cycle management. We're going to talk about the EPMO as a vehicle to manage all the above. And then we're going to talk about a specific methodology to help implement change. So first, starting with best practice of portfolio management. And based on the poll, we see that there's some gaps within your organizations today. We propose kind of a standard process for execution of portfolio management, full life cycle, starting with the collection of ideas or requests, and going all the way through the assessment of the benefits of a project, and creating a feedback loop into, through lessons learned and improving the overall process. Keeping the eye on the cost benefit of the project and making adjustments in your portfolio. So that's often a big gap in terms of organizations that see the projects are going off track, but don't reassess the business case, when really they should, maybe strongly consider, killing a project. And most organizations, tend to let those go and finish out. So a little bit on each of these steps in the process. Collecting the request Ideally there's a central point where ideas or requests, good ideas are fed into a pipeline and, go through a screening process before they get to a kind of an executive decision. So depending on the size of your organization, you may have a couple different steps, and you may have different thresholds for projects that get channeled up to an executive committee via, an EPMO. But the main recommendation there is have a central way to collect the requests, assess them against some parameters, and ensure that each idea or request is somehow aligned to your goals and objectives. Assessing business value, we recommend for most organizations a project scorecard where they can quantify and compare projects in terms of business value. This can be a challenging technique or tool to develop, but very valuable in terms of executives gaining consensus on what's most important to organizations. Part of the screening process is once we determine which projects we see as most valuable, how do we then compare that against constraints that we have? And typically those constraints are either dollars or people. And Gus alluded to earlier, we see a lot of organizations that actually have the capital budget or expense budget to execute on the projects, but they just don't have the right people. So without solid planning from an annual or biannual perspective, it's difficult to have insight into when you're going to need the right people on the right projects at the right time. So it's critical to have a vantage point out 12, 18 months, if possible, in terms of both your active portfolio and your planned portfolio. In terms of measure and respond, often we recommend and we see some type of governance around projects, either an executive committee or a steering committee, or both. Really in terms of keeping the projects on course, headed toward their ultimate destination. An executive team is often there to remove roadblocks or provide direction as business climate changes. And last but not least in the portfolio management process is this analysis of the portfolio benefits. So if you think of your portfolio similar to a financial portfolio, you want to make sure you have the right mix of projects. So you may have some projects that are looking at generating revenue, others that are cost reduction types of projects, others that are mandated, or you're building up your corporate infrastructure. And it's important to, as projects go through execution and beyond delivery, conduct an assessment of how well did they actually meet their originally stated goals. And often you can extract from this process lessons learned, things that you might do differently next time with similar projects, or just modifications or adjustments that you need to make to your CVA process. So I'm going to move next to project management as a best practice. I'll probably spend the least amount of time on this one, since it was scored most highly in terms of, this is a strength for your organizations. We do typically see that this is the most mature process that we typically look at in terms of an organization's ability to execute, starting with the definition of a project scope, going through the planning, organization of the project, going through work breakdown structures, solidifying the project plan, going through the estimation process, and essentially finishing up with baselining of a project, which we see the majority of clients, our clients, still do not baseline projects, which can be problematic because we can't measure what we don't, we can't manage what we don't measure. So it's highly recommended that you really put a stake in the ground around the schedule, put a stake in the ground around budget, and solidify that project scope, and then you can start to measure results against a plan. We then get into the steps of monitoring and controlling. Most of these you're probably familiar with. Typically, the biggest challenge we see here in the monitoring and controlling stage and project execution is around the management of scope. So we see, this is the most volatile area within a project. New ideas come up, the business changes. As you dive into design, often more better ideas come through your clients. So it's important to solidify this scope from a baselining perspective, and then have a solid change management approach in place as you execute a project. And then you've always got that important feedback loop post-project in terms of capturing lessons learned, feeding those good ideas back into your overall process. Lifecycle management, and this is going to vary from company to company. So depending on what you're producing, it could be new products, it could be systems, it could be IT infrastructure, life sciences, new products. We have a bunch of examples here, but it's important to have a deliberate and structured approach in terms of how you deliver those goods or services. Corporate initiatives can be blown out into areas like large capital projects, how you go about the mergers and acquisitions, and organizational change.
And these are the kind of projects I guess we see Jim pretty often when this EPMO term starts to come up, right?
Absolutely. So we see projects that are siloed. If you have a department-specific project, we don't, if you're focused on those, you don't see the large need for something like an EPMO. But when you start to get into these large capital projects that span across different divisions or departments, you start to get into conflicts in terms of priorities, maybe different objectives across the different divisions. And when you have a large percentage of these large projects or cross-divisional projects, this is where we see a stronger demand for things like an EPMO. We're going to talk about process integration here as a best practice. So this is a common stumbling block for a lot of organizations and clients that we see, in terms of they may be very good at, for example, lifecycle management, rolling out new products, or they may have a very strong software development lifecycle. But when they get into these large initiatives, they don't look at these other processes and integrate or interface with the other processes. So let me give you an example to make it more tangible. We did work for a large insurance company that had a pretty formal product development life cycle. And then the IT organization began to mature and created an SDLC, system development life cycle, to create new products, technology projects, and software. What they failed to look at is the integration between new product development and technology. So the product development life cycle also already had technology components, but they didn't integrate well with the life cycle management when the new SDLC was created within IT. The other consideration was around project management. So there's also a project management life cycle that was independent of the SDLC, and you have to look at the integration points. So you can't have those processes, although they're separate, they need to be integrated or interfaced.
You could even argue putting a program management layer in there, which we tend to kind of lump into project management, but it really is a different animal. And we saw that come up in the poll, right? This idea of managing cross-dependencies. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Those cross-dependencies get really tricky when you have multiple life cycles trying to orchestrate together.
Yeah, I've seen situations where, there's a strong project management process in place, but we don't know really how it sets up against a new product development. So my project management lifecycle says I have to deliver a project charter. But what point in time do I deliver that when I'm delivering a new product? So they have to be fully aligned. They're just not effective as an independent process. So we're going to talk about effective ways to start to look at the integration of these processes when we talk about the EPMO, which we're going to roll into right now. So at the highest level, we're looking at an organization that's created to oversee and direct these multiple life cycles and processes. So we attempted here to show a picture of an organization that wraps some governance structure, potential technology, overall process, and putting people with the right skill sets in position to orchestrate this complex environment where you've got multiple processes executing concurrently and layering on top of technology. As we move to the next slide, we're going to talk about, here comes the EPMO, carrying the flag, helping us toward our mission. So in terms of definition of an EPMO, typically, it's defined as a centralized business function operating at the most strategic level within an organization. Provides enterprise support for the things that we just mentioned: project governance, best practices in terms of process, education, organizational structure, tools, templates, and the integration of all these procedures and technology. As with any new organization that gets created, it's really critical to have executive support and use the EPMO as a vehicle for change within a company. There's different flavors of the EPMO, which we're going to talk about momentarily here. But most often, we'll see at a minimum, the EPMO will own the corporate standards in terms of process. So typically, the project management life cycle, the portfolio management process, and potentially some of the other life cycle procedures are owned in other parts of the organization. So EPMOs in practice, in terms of evolution, occasionally we see EPMOs that start kind of from the ground up, where the EPMO is the first PMO structure in an organization. That's the least common. More often than not, we see an EPMO that originates as a business PMO or maybe an IT PMO, and then that PMO has success, within a business unit or within IT, and then kind of evolves where once they see the need for an EPMO.
And the question that's happening at that point, I guess most often we see, Jim, is if there's a serious problem at the enterprise level, we're not going to start from scratch. We're going to start poaching the best talent out there. So would it be safe to say we may see some reluctance from the business unit and the PMO that they're, matter of fact, we see this even in standard PMOs, right? The best PMO directors get on the hardest projects, and they get stopped from running the PMO. So PMO directors that are great, they're highly drafted, right?
Yeah, I mean, we do see organizations that once they've been successful, say within a business unit, running a PMO, those usually tend to be elevated because they do see the big value that the PMO is adding at that business unit level. And often those PMO directors at the business unit level are asked to kind of step up or at least provide a lot of experiences and share some of the ideas that work well for them.
Or you promote it to the PMO and the EPMO and leave a vacuum in the one that was working okay.
Yeah, that kind of gets to that last one where, so you've got a successful say, IT PMO, that individual gets elevated to the EPMO, and then you do have that vacuum because there's still going to be a need for that IT PMO. And I've been in, I've seen large corporations that will have PMOs at each and every business unit level, as well as a EPMO. But that's for the more mature organizations. In terms of scope, and I love Gus's expression, we see the scope. The PMO can be either fairly narrow or broad, starting most narrowly with they own the process only. Gus calls it the Moses model. So the EPMO stands at the top of the hill with the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt follow these processes, right? And those are the ones that tend to struggle the most and are the least likely to be adopted. They don't really have the teeth most often to be successful when they just own the process. The ones that are more successful own both the process and also have a stake in governance, meaning they're often involved in the portfolio selection, as well as maybe overseeing or auditing projects as they go through the life cycle. So bringing mentoring and education to project teams, getting the feedback and keeping the projects on track. And finally, the most comprehensive type of model is, call it full scale, or where they also own execution. So an EPMO, that they own the processes, they own the oversight or governance, but they also have project managers or program managers themselves that are executing typically these large-scale projects. They're, the mergers, the acquisitions, the large corporate initiatives, the major systems implementations that cross, multiple departments. Those ones tend to be the most successful. They've got skin in the game. They tend to have heavy top-down support, and typically reporting directly to a chief operating officer, or even sometimes directly to a CEO. So in terms of benefits of EPMO, I'm going to kind of fly through these pretty quickly. With a strong portfolio management process and an EPMO guiding the delivery that portfolio, you tend to have better strategic alignment. You're more clearly aligning the project execution to your overall business drivers. Often, much better visibility in terms of what's happening in the organization, and better decision making as a result of that visibility. Improved collaboration, coordination across departments. You've got the department heads speaking to one another, sharing information, especially in those cross departmental projects. You tend to get, better leadership in terms of the CEO or the COO having better insight into visibility in terms of project progress. The business leaders really understanding the project mix in the portfolio.
And a lot of this we do as PMOs is we create these forums for this collaboration and for this buy-in, right? We do that communication thing the project managers do so well, and just sort of facilitate the process, which a lot of people call project management adult supervision for adults. This applies to executives too, we see, right, Jim?
Yeah, we have a class actually. Gus teaches it on leading project leaders, and it's really around really clearly defining the role of project executives or project sponsors, because there seems to be a large gap in terms of the capabilities that they have, and really understanding the questions that they need to be asking and the information that they need to seek in order to really execute or lead a project successfully as a sponsor. Again, improved understanding and perspective on cross-project dependencies is a strong benefit. Better execution, more visibility, and certainly, the benefit of getting products and services to market quicker is increased revenue for the corporation. We didn't talk much about capacity management. I mentioned it briefly, but getting the visibility of these large initiatives and your total portfolio is an incredible benefit from an EPMO, and marrying that supply and demand of resources. And also, we're going to reduce overlap. Often we see organizations that kind of run in silos. They can often, be working on even the same types of projects at the same time. So when you have an enterprise PMO that's looking at all initiatives across all departments, can be a big cost savings in terms of eliminating low value-added projects, as well as reducing or eliminating redundancy. And finally, just the bottom line is just a greater overall return on your investment in the portfolio, and the right mix. Do we have the right mix of revenue generation projects, cost reduction projects, risk reduction projects, et cetera? And that mix could change from year to year, depending on the market and the company objectives. A quick, sample cost benefit for moving ahead with an EPMO. I'm not going to spend much time in here, other than to say, if you've got a large investment in your portfolio, 50 million, 100 million, 150 million, it doesn't take much in terms of percentage gain to break even on the investment in an EPMO. I'm going to kind of pass the leadership of the presentation at this point back to Gus to get into some best practices in terms of methodology to implement change.
Okay, great. So we're still on the topic of best practices. The one thing, when we talk about delivering the future, it's strategies are about delivering change. It's about getting us. If you think about what vision is, it's this idea of, well, vision is describing some place that we are not. Right? It's a future that does exist. It's a future we're trying to make exist, and it's projects that bring that future forward. And so it's about delivering change. And when we talk about our best practice, this what we call VIA, Vision, Implement, and Adopt. It's about changing the way you change. Right? Projects are how you change, and how do you change the way you do your projects, and how do you change the way you deliver portfolios? And for those of you serial attenders of our webinar, I appreciate that, and you certainly have seen this slide before. So for those of you who have been through this, Vision, Implement, and Adopt discussion, I'll start off by saying, well, what's different, right? And oftentimes we talk about this in an organization that's maybe trying to put in Project Server. We're a Microsoft project partner, and we're experts on Project Online, and we're trying to wrap around this thinking process. This, instead of just going right into implementation, how do we set the table with some kind of a roadmap? And what changes here is really the scope, right? Like if somebody were to say to us, well, that first step you do, which we call an AVR, it's analysis, vision, and roadmap. How's it different when you're looking at an enterprise? And the answer is the scope is bigger. The activities aren't vastly different. The work we've made, certainly the work in talking to people, talking to more people, getting more perspectives. And what that means is, when we think about that second deliverable, vision is when you see the bottom of that first column, what that vision is, if we get into a little bit of description there, is an agreed upon vision, right? So now we're really, not only are we herding cats at this point, it gets a little bit like herding feral cats, right? And so getting a lot of alignment in an organization where you've got multiple business units working together to deliver on those corporate initiatives, that methodology becomes a little bit more challenging, and in our skills as collaborators and using good judgment and working in that gray area and helping facilitate some of those decisions and trade-offs really becomes key, because at the end of the day, this becomes the mission for the enterprise PMO, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit, because really this is a general methodology for getting better at portfolio and project management. But in today's terms, it's about how do we do this around EPMO, right? So the implementation part, when we, once we develop that roadmap, the implementation itself is, if you look at the, those 4 boxes around that central gray box, when we think about defining process and implementing technology and defining governance and getting people the skills that they need and having the roles well defined, all those things I just said all lend themselves to these phases. What's the requirement for the process? What's the requirement for the technology? What's the requirement for the people and the skills and roles? What's the requirement to make governance work together? And what we've seen happen is, we have a great example that we're working on right now with the PMO director, where this person has recognized that you don't just build project management process, you build governance next to it. For every process we do, to say an execution process, what's the oversight part of this? And so, the implement, in our case, becomes an implementation of the roadmap, and not surprisingly, we'll show an example of this. It's a list of charters. When we talk about defining projects, this roadmap is a miniature portfolio of initiatives to change the way we change, right? And the implementation is, frankly, executing each of those initiatives like separate projects, or maybe we could call it a program of related projects to come out with a common benefit.
The other consideration, and we see this often, is when organizations start an EPMO, the first thing they want to do is go out and buy a technology platform. And even though we're Microsoft partners and we do quite a bit of work in the PPM technology space, we're the first persons to recommend, start with the process, start with the people, execute these processes on paper and spreadsheets before you leverage a technology.
Yeah, there's this belief in some of the customers we deal with, and not surprisingly, it's not a criticism. It's just it's an understandable mistake of perception, is that we've been using Microsoft Project for a long time. We'll just pull those plans off the desktop and we'll publish them, and everything will be hunky dory. And you got to be able to do it on paper, then on the desktop, and then at the enterprise level. And that goes for project execution as well as the portfolio management piece. And then the adoption, this is the key. It's not uncommon to have a structure defined for an EPMO, to have the processes defined, to have some technology to support that, to have projects in there, to have a portfolio supporting process, and now the question is anybody really going to use it? And this is the most, I would say, ignored or misunderstood. It's really about change management, and change management isn't a memo. It's a way of life. It's a set of processes. It's a set of things we have to do to audit and follow up, and really the question becomes, how do we make the pain of non-compliance higher than the pain of compliance, but hopefully not approach it that way. So this is just a quick overview of a roadmap initiative prioritization. You can see we talk about disciplines. Here you see some mixes of some life cycle disciplines with some project management disciplines and even some portfolio disciplines like gate approvals. And Jim, you want to talk about those colors for a second?
Yeah, we just this is an example from of a technique that we use quite often. Just a simple 9-block diagram where we look at prioritization, simply in a graphic by looking at impact and effort. So the items in green there, have higher impact than effort, and the items in red, a lot of effort, more so than the gain or benefit. So it's a simple technique to graphically show which projects or initiatives should we potentially move forward first, and then maybe some of the more complex ones or more difficult, maybe we can wait on those in terms of developing the roadmap.
Thanks, Jim. And then, of course, what we're really talking about here is the roadmap, and this is just a very simple example. This would be in several pages and a lot more columns, but we decided that if we're going to talk about an EPMO, what do we see coming out of a roadmap typically when an EPMO is being chartered? And so we see the charter itself, right? An EPMO has a mission and a scope, and Jim talked about some of those scopes in terms of, you know, is it about process, is it the Moses model? We see that sometimes. You know, we see where there are business units and the EPMO is only allowed to recommend standards, doesn't own execution, doesn't own governance. So the mission and scope is not standard, right? It's there are flavors, but they're certainly not standard. The organizational structure and staffing plan, right? So this is not free, right? So something's got to happen in the organization. People need to be given authority. Roles have to be defined. Headcount has to be put in place. Oftentimes, you know, we help with that. We you know, stay behind and support some of the execution of the roadmap. The project management standards, policies, and procedures, and that would apply to potentially life cycle management, portfolio management, all those methodologies we talked about. The platform, right? Whether it's process, whether it's technology, probably both. The governance structure, which we talked about, that's something that has to be built and be followed, and when it's done well, it's really a beautiful thing. And a training plan, right? So that's part of how we get the roles, performing the roles.
One note to add to that, and I've seen this many a time, you set up a organizational structure for your EPMO, you have a strong staffing plan, you've actually staffed it, and what we find is the people in your PMO tend to get cherry-picked. They get pulled off into major projects or projects that are having troubles, and the next thing you know, you have an EPMO of 8 people, and you're down to 3 people that are actually focused on moving the EPMO forward. The rest are back in the trenches executing projects. So it's really critical to have that top-down support. You know, obviously you're going to have to be flexible in times of in times of need, but you really kind of stay the course. And in order to do that, you really got to have top-down support.
So we have a poll.
Poll number 3.
And poll number 3. This is actually a web page. This is a project assistance web page, and it gets to a question. Poll number 3. Okay. So we're running the poll in the background. So while we're running the poll in the background, let's talk about so AVR, we mentioned that is we call that the vision step in our methodology. And so there is, if you're interested in an AVR, certainly we recommend that as a step. By the way, we do not assume that you don't have a roadmap or you have no vision. We do not mean to insult anybody by saying you haven't thought about this. I mean, we bring a host of experience in a wide variety of organizations, and the idea is, depending on where you are in your process, we can help bring some know-how and some bandwidth and some sense of urgency, and the outside consulting magic that you pay for advice and maybe people follow it. It's all those things, right? So there's that. And, the deployment of Project Server, Project Online is a very common platform. Still, probably the de facto standard out there. The virtual PMO, which we staff, we have a project management staffing capability, and training programs. Jim mentioned leadership. We do requirements. We do risk. We do a lot of the high-level stuff that the most critical stuff. So, and by the way, if you are a project manager and you'd like to work for a company that eats, sleeps, and drinks project management, then you come to the right place. Kayla leads our recruiting team, and her email address is there. We would love to have your resume. Parting gifts. So if you go to projectassistance.com/webinar, you get the chapter from our project book, which still applies to 2016. Discounts on the book. Downloads for the slide deck. We get a lot. So if anybody's going to send an email, going to have the slide deck, I can save you an email. The answer is yes. If you go to this web page in the next 24 hours, probably won't have it out there today, but we captured this video and many other videos. So if you want the recording of this or previous webinars, and many Project 2013 how-to videos. Our next webinar, Facing Reality and Driving Success Through Effective Project Leadership and Sponsorship. So we're going to go down that path of how we can do projects from the leaders of the business and get these folks to work in harmony. There is not a link yet? There is a link, okay.
On the webinar site.
On the webinar page, if you want to for this May 18th webinar, that's on our webinar page, and it'll also be on our events page, I presume, Dan? Okay, so if you want to register there, and we have a minute for questions, or are we done? Do we have any questions?
We do have several questions, so if you want to hang on for overtime, then you're certainly welcome to. If you have obligations at 4 o'clock, obviously we won't take it personally if you drop off. So one of the questions we have coming in is, in your experience, how much of resource capacity issues can be attributed to the calendar year planning?
Oh, want me to take that one, guys?
Yes, please. I know you like that topic.
I love that topic.
Thanks, Michael.
I think calendar year planning, has a major impact in terms of being an issue. So projects don't start on January 1st and finish on December 31st. The large ones, more often than not, tend to overlap calendar years or fiscal years. So it's critical to keep your supply and demand process looking at the longer term, more than just the next few months, the next calendar period. It's important and critical to have that view into the future. So for that reason, we don't recommend a process that's only done at annual planning time, that it's revisited at least quarterly in terms of major project planning. Certainly in terms of getting feedback from active projects, that's an ongoing process.
Thank you, Jeff. Another question we have coming in is, do you use a tool to baseline? If so, what do you use?
Well, we use typically whatever tool is being used. As we've mentioned, we're a Microsoft project partner, and my book on Microsoft Project is one of the top sellers on Amazon, coming out in the second edition through Kendall Hunt in the university and in the industry channels. And, the Microsoft Project takes a good baseline of the schedule. In terms of taking a baseline to measure the effectiveness of an EPMO, that's a whole other kettle of fish. We see a great inability to really capture what's going on. We had a great conversation at the end of last week on Friday with a rare organization that's working on scoring the effectiveness of standards and technologies and processes to really create a baseline. We certainly recommend that. And the baselines, I guess we would say, come in two flavors, right? There's the baseline of, if I can just net it out, are you meeting the business case, right? So that's the most simplest and the most value you can get. The second one we like to talk about when we talk about adoption is, how do we take a baseline on the effectiveness of the portfolio project management process? And it's those two things that really give us a sense of, are we getting better? And of course, the big challenge is, is our average project today coming in better and faster than the average project did a year ago? And the problem is, there's no such thing as an average project. So, Jim, do you want to add something to that?
Just that in terms of measuring the process, we do have a proprietary methodology that looks at 15 different disciplines across the PPM space. And we actually quantify those results in terms of an organization's maturity. So there is a way to measure improved process through a methodology or a model that we've developed. And then certainly the other aspect that Gus mentioned in terms of the bottom line, looking at, are we delivering faster, better, cheaper? I think that's a discussion we could take offline, but we could share some techniques around that as well.
And really, the bottom line result of effective portfolio management is called benefits realization, right? And that is probably the biggest weakness we see. Of all the processes we talked today, that's the one that is kind of the caboose on the train. It's the last thing you do, and you have to do a whole lot of other things pretty well to get there. Yeah,
we just talked to a client recently, and we said if there's one thing you can measure and compare it to previous years, it would be the value that you returned from the projects that you actually delivered. So that would be the NPV or net present value potentially of those projects that were actually delivered, during some period of time. But again, that's a process that's difficult to obtain, and a process that requires other project management processes to be mature.
We do still have many of our attendees hanging around and more questions trickling in, so I think we'll stick around and chat with you guys as long as you'd like. We have another question. It's a two-parter. Would you agree that the EPMO would be best run by a VP, and would you agree that the skills for an EPMO would not necessarily be senior PM skills?
Great question. I would say to the first one, it certainly depends on the situation. When Jim was talking about pulling a PMO director off onto a hot project, one of my most striking examples I can think of is a customer we have who's a senior VP who runs a PMO who has, believe it or not, 600 project managers working for him, and he got pulled off to run a project. Okay, if you want to guess who the title was, you might guess real fast. It was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. So, but here's a VP. I mean, 600 people. The question is, what does a VP manage, and how many layers of management do you need? And when a PMO gets that big, I think the answer is yes. It should be a VP. And the great thing, especially at an EPMO level, if you're responsible for bringing together that many disparate units, being able to play at that level with that amount of tenure and experience and clout in the organization, I think is important. And what was the second part?
That the EPMO skills don't overlap with senior PM skills.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about pure management, right? So the one thing I would say that does overlap, we emphasize quite a bit when we look at our project managers, those business management skills, right? So I think, if you look at just the pure technical or process skills of a project manager, I would say, I would agree with that. That's different. When we get to just the raw general management skills, a great senior project can make a good PMO director, but it's a tricky transition.
All right, so a few more questions if you guys are on board. We have, I believe this came up while you were going through the VIA methodology, and you mentioned something about 15% cost savings. Would you say those cost savings were made up what made up the 15% cost savings by implementing an EPMO, and did it net out the cost of the EPMO?
Okay, so did it include the cost of setting up an EPMO? Pretty sure the answer is no on that. So it's a good question, but it is a recurring savings every year. So I think the example shows a $15 million portfolio, which is modest for a lot of large IT shops, saving $1.5 million a year. So that is the direct savings on the projects themselves without the cost of the EPMO. Jim, anything you would add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other consideration there is we talked about if you're able to deliver a new product, a new service, something that's generating a revenue more quickly, then the company is also obtaining the benefit. Not only was the project delivered on time, but you're starting to receive the benefits of that new product or service, the increased revenue more quickly. So I think that's really important when you think about rolling out those types of projects, that they stay on time. And those benefits can start as planned.
And one final question. Are you seeing a trend for where PMO organizations exist within a company organizational structure, is there a rise to move outside of IT?
From our friend Denise. Hi, Denise. You take that one, Jim?
Yeah, so I mean,
That's one of the flavors we developed.
yeah, it is a flavor. And more often than not, we do see an EPMO that evolves either through information technology or through another business unit. And they usually evolve mainly driven by the success of that business unit PMO. So the business unit PMO matures, really shows value within an individual department, and then they start, organizations start to look at, let's consider this type of organization in a broader scale. So it's fairly common that it's an evolution rather than a revolution.
Well said, Jim. Thanks, everybody, for your questions. Dan, did you have any wrap-up comments?
That's all we have. And be sure to claim your parting gifts at projectassistance.com/webinar. That includes the slides, how to claim PDUs, several other common questions that we get after these webinars.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.